I'm Rio, and this is Rio's Experimental Archaeology. I'm an archaeologist in the American Southwest. Early archaeologists often assumed that artifacts were static, lifeless objects. In this episode, I am building on the foundational concept of an artifact's life history to show that artifacts are never static and lifeless, but rather living, breathing entities intimately tied to the physical landscapes that they reside in. We will also be visiting backcountry archaeological sites where we will see these living artifacts in their true context. Understanding the life history of an artifact is how we move beyond passively viewing the past to actively listening to the stories of the ancients. In our last episode, we dived into the work of Reed and colleagues to investigate a millennia-old mystery, a strange, waxy, bumpy coating found on ancient lino greywares. To test their hypothesis that this was an indigenous sealant technology, we replicated wild clay corrugated vessels and treated them with a hot juniper berry mash. In this episode, we are continuing the journey of the seal corrugated mug and introducing an ongoing project of mine, a basalt boulder I have been slowly pecking into a functional groundstone tool to use as part of my ancient kitchen. We're using these objects to act as a bridge between the present and the past in an exploration of the dynamic life history of artifacts. I'm currently in northern Arizona in the San Francisco Volcanic Fields. The most well-known archaeological site in the San Francisco Volcanic Fields is Wupatki. Influence at Wupatki reached from Chaco Canyon to Mesoamerica. I'm currently searching for a site associated with Wupatki because Wupatki is known to be a cultural crossroads where multiple archaeological groups converged and cohabitated the same pueblos peacefully. In 1972, Michael Schiffer formalized the concept of an artifact's life history in the foundational paper Archaeological Context and Systemic Context. Schiffer argued that artifacts exist in two completely different states: systemic context, where they are dynamically active within a living human culture, and archaeological context, where they remain static after being discarded. To track an object's transition through these phases, Schiffer mapped 5 distinct stages: procurement, manufacture, use, maintenance, and discard. By using replication to bring our corrugated mug and our basalt groundstone back to a functional living state, we're better able to understand the choices made by ancient peoples using similar tools. But this is where I disagree with Schiffer. An artifact is never static. It doesn't matter whether an artifact was carefully discarded, forgotten, left behind, or sealed away as people move forward. It doesn't just sit there as dead data. It continues to have a relationship with the soil, the plants growing around it, the histories who remember it, and the people who return to the landscape. It's a few days later. I got a sunburn on my eyes from putting the camera between the sun and I. So I hope you don't mind, but I'll be wearing sunglasses from now on. Now I know we're all eager to head out into the field and see some cool archaeology, but before we begin that adventure, I wanted to review what we've learned so far. We've established a theoretical foundation that every interaction, human or natural, leaves a direct mark on an artifact's life history.
Yeah.
And now with that foundation laid, it's finally time to introduce you to the ancient inhabitants that were shaped this landscape, the Sinagua. Let's check out a Sinagua site. Now, how do we know it's a Sinagua site? Ceramics. Architecture. And location. In the 1940s, Harold Colton and John McGregor defined the Sinagua as a melting pot of distinct archaeological cultures, primarily Hohokam and Kayenta migrants, who flooded the San Francisco Volcanic Fields and blended with the local Kohonina groups after the 1085 CE eruption of Sunset Crater transformed dry desert into fertile farmlands. Ooh, there's a beautiful bit of pottery. To the modern archaeologists and descendant communities, the Sinagua, or Hisatsuno, do not simply represent a tray of mixed cultural traits. This landscape was a dynamic, transformative space where groups such as the Hohokam, Kayenta, and Kohonina actively swapped ideas and emerged entirely transformed. They did not leave the peaks as they were when they arrived. They left as a unique product of their shared time together in the mountains. Different groups lived together in the same communities and actively transformed as one. Although some look at the architecture of allegedly defensive sites like the Citadel, or at isolated assemblages to make claims of widespread violence, the archaeological record does not support such claims. The Sinagua region was divided into a frontier zone that formed after the eruption of Sunset Crater in 1085 CE and a heartland that began to solidify around 1150 CE. This imposing landform behind me looks like the perfect place to set the scene for talking about competition and survival strategies in the San Francisco Volcanic Fields. Let's head on up there and see if we can find some defensive structures. Before we even get into trying to call this a defensive site, I wanted to bring up a point I mentioned earlier, that it's impossible to interpret the past then from any position other than today. So in looking at defensive sites, and Frederick Michael O'Hara points this out, that they might not actually be defensive. It is highly possible that people chose to build on top of high elevated landforms in order to have a big view shed, to be able to see far distances, and not specifically for defense. According to the work of Frederick Michael O'Hara III, only 3 frontier zone sites exhibited any evidence of severe violence, all of which occurred during the 1130 to 1160 megadrought. 1 was a ritual execution, and 2 were raids. As the drought began to ease around 1150 CE, a new, more cohesive heartland began to take shape, defined by the rise of aggregated pueblos. Isolated occurrences of violence in the heartland were managed, ritual, and formal, with the individuals often receiving high-status burials. Notably, none of the 16 allegedly identified defensive structures showed any evidence of actual warfare. Based on this evidence, cooperation turned out to be a far more successful survival strategy than competition and violence, a balance that all long-enduring societies must figure out to survive. Beyond architecture, in the US 89 Mortuary Analysis project, Mark Elson reveals how Sunset Crater's tephra deposits significantly boosted agricultural yields. The skeletal record reflects this surplus. Rather than showing trauma associated with territorial competition, these populations remain stable and healthy despite periodic environmental upheavals. This stability was a collective survival strategy. The archaeological record demonstrates that these communities thrived by prioritizing shared infrastructure and extensive regional trade networks. There's a beautiful piece of corrugated pottery. By investing in communal resources and trade ties, these ancient peoples successfully mitigated environmental uncertainty, effectively replacing the need for competition with a foundation of cooperative resilience. This wasn't just a safety net, it was reciprocal. When one community faced hardships, others were there to support them, creating a cycle of mutual reliance that sustained all. This raises a fundamental question. What was this cooperative resilience actually founded on? If it wasn't just resource management, what social order held these diverse groups together, not apart? In summary, we have examined multiple lines of evidence, from artifacts, architecture, archaeological survey and excavation reports, site use over time, and mortuary practices, and found no evidence of systemic, widespread violence. Additionally, there is no evidence that Wupatki or the ball court served as mechanisms of an authoritarian state. Rather, social order was likely maintained through the cosmological and spiritual frameworks represented at these sites. Essentially, shared cosmological and spiritual beliefs acted as the framework that held people together. Now that we have established that Wupatki and the San Francisco Volcanic Fields were a part of the broader Pueblo world, things get fascinating. This shared cosmology is physically represented in ancient pottery designs. In the mid-1100s, northern Arizona saw the explosive appearance of the Flagstaff style of pottery, a shared visual language defined by barbed teeth, fine cross-hatching, ticked edges, and interlocking rectilinear scrolls. Check out this viewpoint I came to up here. This pottery appeared during a time of major migration and social reorganization across the Southwest. It was a massive, interconnected effort to standardize ideology across the region using pottery designs. Because communities were manufacturing the Flagstaff style themselves, using local clay and materials, we know this wasn't a centrally manufactured product, but a widespread, intentional adherence to a shared Pueblo worldview. Now, I know it might seem like we got a little distracted getting into our discussion about the Sinagua, but it's important to understand the people who built artifacts in order to understand the life history of the artifacts that they've used. Although most of this discussion was not specifically aimed at corrugated pottery, it was aimed at the Sinagua. And the Sinagua are famous for their corrugated pottery. We're coming up to one of my favorite archaeological sites where I found corrugated pottery that gave me the motivation to make my own. So I figured this would be the best place to talk about the life history of corrugated pottery, because it has had a huge bearing on my history with corrugated pottery. So let's check it out. Just right up here in these rocks. We got a looter's pile. Ah, it's over here. We have this structure here. Has a beautiful door and an amazing view. This is the hill that I found the pottery on that inspired me to make my corrugated mug that you might have seen in that last video of mine. So let's check it out and see if we can find that shirt again. Here it is. Look at that. Now that is a beautiful bit of corrugated pottery right there. I have returned to this same site 3 or 4 times to look at this same piece of pottery and think about how I can use what I've learned through this sherd in my own corrugated pottery. Now, most people will tell you to leave artifacts where you find them because that's what archaeologists say. I am an archaeologist, so I'm going to take a bit of a different approach. I'm going to show you why you should leave artifacts in the field. What I have today is a black tea peppermint licorice. It's one of my personal favorites. When I made my corrugated mug, I had no idea how good that video would do. I am beyond pleased, so I really want to thank you for subscribing and following along this journey. Now I know we never got around to the groundstone, and I'm sorry about that. In order to establish the life history of an artifact, it's really important to show you the ancient peoples who are making and using these objects. Most of this episode was dedicated to a history lesson, introducing the Sinagua and the landscape they reside in. I mentioned earlier that I have come to this same site several times looking for the same pottery, and that's not a lie. I do that to several sites, and that's why you should leave artifacts where you find them, because there's people like me, descended communities, and you, if you get into ancient pottery, who are going to be coming out here to these sites. If you take that pottery away, you're robbing someone else of the ability to have the same inspiration. Now, I'm not trying to shame people who have picked up an artifact. I'm just trying to show you a different perspective. So next time that you encounter a potsherd that you really want to pocket, consider first, it's federally illegal, and second, think about Rio, your favorite experimental archaeologist, who spends his life walking this landscape, looking at pottery, trying to get inspiration to make my own crafts, and put the pieces of the puzzle together to see the broader Puebloan world. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Please remember to like and subscribe.